Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Eva van Ooij will defend the academic thesis entitled Highly Mobile Workers and the Coordination of Social Security in the EU, Opening and Closing Pandora's Box. May I invite you, Eva, to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. You have the floor.
Thank you. Dear Prorector, highly esteemed opponents, dear colleagues, family and friends, and dear viewers. In the coming 15 minutes, I take up the challenge to explain to you 4 years of research in the field of EU social security law. How did it start? Well, being a young professional myself, I observed that some people have one job, others do various things to make their living. Let's imagine Jackie. Oh, we need to do it really, sorry. A little technical issue here. Let's imagine Jackie. Living in Belgium, working as an independent IT consultant. She specialized in backend C++ programming. She gives advice to various companies in Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. At the start of every project, she usually visits her clients. Later on in the project, she works remotely, and she likes to do that from Portugal. It's good weather and a good internet connection. Lately, she has taken over the direction of a startup company based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Closer to here, we have Vincent. He's an opera singer living in Aachen, Germany. He works at the opera in Liège, Belgium, and he joins some world tours with André Rieu and his orchestra, with a base in Maastricht. And because of his excellent interpretation of Strauss lyrics, he provides master classes at the Conservatoire of Paris in France. What do we see here? What kind of professions do we see? They do different professions, and they also work in different countries. We see that they're not engaged in one full-time job, but in different places and in different work engagements. If we observe carefully, we can see actually two forms of mobility. Geographic mobility, crossing country borders, but also job mobility, moving between jobs, work engagements, and sometimes working in engagements at the same time. How could we label these kind of people? Well, these kind of people who pursue these two forms of mobility, I call highly mobile workers. Now, what if our opera singer Vincent breaks his leg? He falls off the stage of the opera. He cannot perform for the next 2 to 3 months. Does he have a right to sickness benefits? And if so, who is going to pay for these sickness benefits? This brings me to my research questions that I explored in 2 parts. In the first part, I searched an answer to the question, where is the highly mobile worker insured? And do they face any problems? In the second part, I explored the questions, how could we solve these issues addressed by EU law? Therefore, I did desk research, but I also did relate to social reality by using fictitious samples. To answer these questions, we need to look into EU social security law. What is that? EU social security law wants to facilitate the free movement of workers and to coordinate the different social security schemes for cross-border workers. It wants to ensure that a worker has access to one social security scheme, and at the same time it does not be subject to the rights and obligations of 2 different systems. How does it do so? Well, first of all, it's a coordination instrument. It does not allow harmonization of laws. This means that every EU member state can make its own rules about the rights and obligations of social security law. It's not a social security scheme in itself. Secondly, it has a set of rules that decide which law is applicable. These are called conflict rules. They need to be applied mandatory, binding, and they make sure that only one scheme is applicable. This is also known as a single state rule. In a majority of the cases, it's a state of employment that applies, lex loci laboris, and in some cases, it's the state of the residence, lex domicili. Thirdly, it applies a few principles, such as the principle of equal treatment. The general idea is that the worker do not lose the entitlement of social benefits for which they have paid contributions for. However, this does not mean that working across border is without any effect on the individual level of social security protection. The rights and obligations between these different systems of national schemes, they differ, both positively and negatively. This is because EU social security law is a coordination instrument and not a scheme on itself. For example, if we take our opera singer Vincent and he takes up a job in Milan at the Scala, he will be socially insured in Italy and no longer in Belgium. If he receives family benefit, it will now be according to the Italian law. In this case, he will receive less child benefits than if he would receive in Belgium. He may not like this as a person. However, this is not considered as a problem for EU law. This is just a result of the differences between the national schemes of the member states. That's all. In my research, however, I found a few issues that can be considered as problematic for highly mobile workers. Because highly mobile workers are involved with various jobs, the research has been focusing on the multi-activity rule as conflict rule, Article 13 of Regulation 883/2004. If we observe this multi-activity rule, it has two particularities. Firstly, it applies a hierarchy between the classification of work. If you have a job as civil servant, it has more impact on the decision which law is applicable than the job as a self-employed person. Secondly, we need to look on how many activities are performed in which territory. When a person works 25% or more in the state of residence, the social security scheme of this state applies. In other situations, it depends. Although this conflict rule is only one rule, we have actually 9 possible outcomes. There are many questions to be assessed and answered. This looks something like this. Well, as you can see, for a highly mobile worker, it's not a straightforward thing to know which social security law is applicable. This is particularly because of the lack of precision of the legal text in combination with the irregular work pattern that highly mobile workers face. For example, when a person does the same job but in 2 different countries, the classification of work may differ. So the result of this rule also has another one. Let's take a Latin teacher at a secondary school in the Netherlands, while this person is living in the Netherlands. Under Dutch law, this person is qualified as an employee. The same job under Belgian law, however, is a civil servant. So if the Latin teacher takes up a side job, even for a few hours in Belgium, it's this article that decides that the person will be now socially insured in Belgium. For a Latin teacher just taking up a few hours a side job in another member state, this is difficult to know. There is indeed a lack of easily available, clear and transparent information on certain key concepts for the cross-border worker and their employers. Another issue is that highly mobile workers must basically know and predict how much work is going to be performed in which member state for the coming 12 months. This foreseeability and predictability that is asked by the conflict rule is for certain professions, such as performing artists, practically impossible. As a result, highly mobile workers are confronted with more legal uncertainty. It's more difficult for them to know which social security scheme is applicable to them, and it's also more likely that they're facing a change of social security scheme during their working life, compared with a standard work employment. Why should we bother? Why should we actually care? Well, firstly, it's cumbersome to change administration. But secondly, it's also that a short affiliation to one social security scheme may result in the situation that a highly mobile worker has contributed to various social security schemes, but faces difficulties in claiming certain social rights. So how could we prevent this? In other words, how could we create more legal certainty for highly mobile workers? This brings me to the second part of my research. I defined legal certainty for highly mobile workers that they should be able to make an informed choice before they engage in cross-border work. This means that less legal uncertainty is actually more legal clarity, knowing which laws are applicable, preferably before you engage in cross-border work. And secondly, legal stability, creating a continuous affiliation to one social security scheme. A longer affiliation to one scheme gives the most guarantee for social protection for the short, mid, and long term. So how can we realize this from an EU law perspective? Therefore, I observed different routes in three approaches. The first one considered of routes that maximize the effectiveness and the implementation of the current framework of conflict rules. On the one hand, we could clarify definitions and key concepts that are used by the assessment criteria of Article 13. But we could also inform more proactively the cross-border workers and their employers. On the other hand, we could maybe adapt certain assessment criteria as to allow more changes and irregularities in the work pattern. It is indeed true that the labour market of the 21st century is more fluid and more digital than the one of the 20th century. Secondly, I looked at going beyond the current framework. This would need an adaptation of the Regulation 883/2004. For example, by introducing a special conflict rule for highly mobile workers, or maybe allowing, in certain situations, the coexistence of different national social security schemes at the same time. Lastly, I looked beyond the current framework, thinking out of the box. We could maybe consider supplement the EU coordination instrument by national initiatives as to prevent that EU cross-border workers fall in between two stools. Or we could establish an EU hardship fund as to counterbalance disproportionate effects on social security protection and the legal uncertainty in which these workers sometimes can be for a little while. We could even go that far as to create a virtual member state to which a highly mobile worker can be affiliated to. This would give legal clarity. There is one social scheme applicable, and for a long time, legal stability. Having showed various ways, the next question is, which one is then the way forward? Well, much depends on legal competencies and political willingness, both on EU and national level. We are dealing with various policy levels here. We have the macro level, the EU legislator and the national member states. They can propose hard laws and soft laws. We also have the meso level, the national implementing authorities, who could propose implementing policies. Lastly, there is the micro level, the employer and the worker themselves, who can decide to engage in certain work engagements, yes or no. So what is then the way forward? How can we close Pandora's box? Instead of putting one solution, I concluded my research with one policy recommendations and a few resolution strategies. As to ensure the effectiveness of EU social security law and its conflict rules, it is recommended that the single state rule takes into account a continuity of affiliation of the worker to one social security scheme. In this way, there is less risk in creating a dual reality, namely those highly mobile workers who fit in the system of conflict rules and those highly mobile workers who don't. I thank you for your attention, and I hereby give back the word to the proactor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Marion Berenpas. She holds the chair at this university of Professor of Taxation of Cross-Border Employment. And I give her the floor. Well.
Okay, thank you. Dear candidate, first of all, congratulations with your PhD thesis, researching about highly mobile workers and the coordination of social security law in the European Union, in which you have explored the social security problems of highly mobile workers meticulously and extensively. It is an important but also so far relatively non-regulated topic. Unruly for several reasons. Firstly, for the concerned high mobile workers, who have, even with regard to income from current work, is unable to find his way through the forest. Still apart from the fact that he knows the status of his cross-border position. Secondly, the regulation of cross-border income and social security is a complex and time-demanding, tough process. Your research indisputably contributes to the discussion about the social security contributions of highly mobile workers. In the introduction, you delimitate research as it doesn't comprise tax law. Nevertheless, the word tax appears more than 60 times. Undoubtedly, however, cross-border work problems should be solved by jointly developing labor law, social security law, and tax law, especially in cases in which the financing of the social security by means of taxation is involved. As you appear to be conscious of as well, and here I quote page 267, hence the proposed recommendations can be seen separately from the fields of labor and tax law. Indeed, further research is needed. However, my question is not about, to my opinion, obvious and desired coordination between tax and social security law, but about Article 16 of Regulation 833/2004, the so-called exception clause. Considering the very diverse case histories of highly mobile workers, would not the consultation provision of Article 16 already provide for the solution of many problems? According to the practical guide, this instrument can be invoked between member states in line with the interests of particular persons or groups of persons for the purpose of administrative convenience. However, this should not be the only decisive factor. In the interest of the persons concerned must be the primary focus in these considerations. My question is, to what extent do you think this instrument of Article 16 can be used for the problems of the highly mobile workers, and what should such an agreement look like according to you?
Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. I understood your question that you're asking to how, in what extent Article 16 could be a solution for this group of workers. I think indeed this could be a very good solution for creating legal stability and legal clarity for the highly mobile worker. In practice, however, we don't see that this is used often. There are a few reasons for that. First of all, the Court of Justice ruled that this article needs to be used restrictive. It's an exception clause. So why using exception clause for a group that is dealing with these issues constantly? I've been looking into the multi-activity rule because this rule, conflict rules, actually has the aim and the objective to facilitate the free movement of workers who are working in 2 or more member states, so in multiple activities. Next to that, we know that it's a kind of habit that this article is used for 5 years. So this exception clause is used for 5 years, which is not a solution for highly mobile workers who are dealing during their whole working life, which is in general 40, maybe in the future 50 years. Then we should have to conclude several Article 16. So I don't think it's a structural solution for this group of workers. But of course, in the short term, it would be. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, I would say, what do you want to regulate them? Because the highly mobile workers are so different, so many different situations. So in that case, I would say, okay, maybe Article 16 would be a solution.
Thank you for your elaboration. I do agree that Article 16 is a solution on the short term, and how that could look like is for highly mobile workers who have a stable place of residence. I would say make sure that the state of residence social security scheme applies, which would mean that highly mobile worker needs to do a request to this the authority.
Thank you. I forgot to mention that Professor Werepas is the chair of the assessment committee. The opposition will be continued by Professor Yves Jurgens. He is Professor of European Social Security Law at Ghent University, and I warmly welcome him to our faculty. You have the floor, sir.
Madam Candidate, thank you very much, first of all, for your presentation, and I think you will not be surprised by the fact that I read with a lot of interest your thesis. Highly mobile persons. Now, you know, a doctoral research team, first of all, has to be critical, has to be original, has to be topical, and has to be in depth. And I think I may congratulate you with the fact that you fulfill a lot of these criteria. Well, all of them, presumably. The aspect is also, which I fully appreciate, is the link that you make between the academic world and the practical world. I think this is definitely the case, and you demonstrate that also in changing jobs, although I'm not completely sure that your current employer will always share your ideas that you develop in this book, but that's out of the issue for the moment. What I would like to ask you is, of course, the concept of highly mobility. Because who is a highly mobile worker, basically? The problem is, as you might know, and you clearly demonstrate that the current rules are not appropriate for all migrant workers. I think we all share that. The volatile character leads to the application of a social security legislation which is often not desirable, nor to the benefit neither of the employee and even of the employer, and also the state itself. The question is, of course, that you want to say, okay, how are we going to create a special rule for whom? For the highly mobile worker. But who is the highly mobile worker? Because you're going to create a separate category. Now, creating separate rules for a separate category is one thing. Creating privileges for that category is, of course, something else. So who is highly mobile? I think we all are one or another way, or all migrant workers not highly mobile at a certain stage. You refer to places of people who work in 2 countries or even posting, but everybody once in their life might perhaps become a posted worker or going to work in 2 countries. So my question is a little bit about how do you define highly mobility? Where is for you the distinction between a highly mobile worker and a mobile worker? If I may use this term for that perspective. And let us not forget from that idea as well. So what I want to stress with you is what is the definition, taking into account that Social Security has one particular issue. You refer to legal clarity, means I want to know in advance what the Social Security legislation is. Now, often highly mobility will only be demonstrated afterwards. So how are you going to tackle that?
Thank you for your question, highly esteemed opponent. It's a very good question, and as I already presented in my presentation, it's one of the research challenges I was facing, how to define these kind of people. If we look to the Regulation 883 itself, it does not give a definition of worker. Actually, it only says economic activities based on the national law who can define the worker. So the regulation itself does not define who is a worker for the regulation. It leaves it up to the member state, which is logical because it's a coordination instrument and the EU has no competencies in that regard. So that's why I also didn't define the highly mobile worker in that detail. Still, I would like to give an answer to your questions. Who are they? I think I addressed in my research the qualities of highly mobile workers, so that they are crossing borders and a few times during their working life. The question is, when are you mobile? Because we are all sometimes mobile in our working life. Let's take 40 years. And when becomes this highly mobile work? Well, as my recommendation for continuous affiliation, I argued this would be preferably for 24 months. And why 24 months? Because this is the exception that the EU legislator gave with the posting provision. So somehow you can read in this regulation that there is a desire of certain continuous affiliation, and we can make an exception for mobile/highly mobile workers being not insured in the state of employment if it's for 2 years. If we take that as a starting point, I would argue that highly mobility and also the fact that the law applicable is looked for the next 12 months needs to be somewhere in this period. To draw really a line of where's highly mobile, where's a mobile worker, I think there is further research necessary, which I also recommend, of course, in the end of my book, because it has to do that EU Social Security law is only coordinating, so the material access to social benefits is decided by the national member states. We need to do a research compared where is it still acceptable that people switch, because if you switch often and you will in the end have no material access because you switch too soon, maybe after 3 months, this is already the case, maybe it's 6 months, or maybe it's 8 months. If I take the Netherlands, for example, to get unemployment benefits, you need to have worked 26 weeks in the last 36 weeks, which means already that at least 36 weeks you need to be affiliated here to this. This is 70% more or less of a year. So if you only have 3 months of a job in the Netherlands, forget your unemployment benefits. So making a comparison to what are maybe common minimum periods and state from, okay, if it's above, we can say mobile worker, and if it's below, it's a highly mobile worker, and we need to find a solution for these people. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you. Professor Jorens is also a member of the assessment committee. The opposition will be continued by yet another member of the assessment committee, Professor Paul Schoukens. He is Professor of European and International Social Security Law at Tilburg University and the Catholic University of Leuven. And I also welcome him very much, and I give him the floor. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much also for your presentation, candidate. When I was traveling to Maastricht, it took me some time. I'm coming from Leuven. And I started to wonder, and I started to notice that actually I was in a quite privileged situation, because some years ago I was at the beginning of this doctoral thesis too, when discussing in a young researchers seminar how this could be approached in a slightly more informal setting. It was a young researchers seminar, but it was during free time, spare time at the beach. And even in our spare time at the beach, we are discussing how doctoral degrees and doctoral theses can be developed. I will not give further details. You can ask about that later during the reception or whatever. I would say job quite well done. I will not give a full assessment. I wrote down very positive elements in this doctoral thesis. Very nice research question and research problem, very well documented. The nice balance between theory and practice, and you're also a practical case of a highly mobile worker, at least in the past, as far as I remember. Nice methodology, although sometimes the criteria for the assessment of the current legal framework was not always very well explained. And then in the end, and that's how you look at it, we receive a whole menu of possible approaches. And also in your presentation, you provided that menu. And you have been developing it a bit further by highlighting the feasibility. So you showed that, well, depending upon the choice you make, depending upon the approach you take, it can have some consequences as to the policy, legal grounds, and so on and so forth. And even in the end, you say, optimally, my personal opinion would be that one system would stay applied during the career of the highly mobile worker. But even that can mean different approaches. I think, for instance, of the click right. I mean, myself, I've been developing something on highly mobile researchers, where we once proposed a click right, a possibility that the researcher clicks into a system and stays into the system. 13th state of colleague Peters. And also in your approach, I liked, for instance, very much your suggestion of the Nordic system, where you disconnect the residents from the financing, and the residence is also one system which then, at the end of the day, would be applicable. But I would like to invite you to unveil a little bit more your personal opinion, or you can turn it around. Imagine that somebody at the commission or the commissioner, or maybe the minister, would invite you. That's very nice, but could you say, taking into account your study and what's actually the situation now, what would be the concrete pathway to go for? What kind of approach should we undertake? That's something I would like to hear from you, candidate.
Thank you for your question, highly esteemed opponent. Yes, indeed, I propose many solutions and resolution strategies, but no one solution. I don't think there is one ideal solution, and it depends from which viewpoint you are taking it. If I have to choose, if I'm kind of forced to give one proposition, from the highly mobile worker perspective, which I take in this research, the most ideal solution would be a virtual member state, only one scheme to be affiliated to. However, we all know that this is rather unfeasible to realize. It's actually based on an already old idea in 1992, proposed by Danny Peters. We are more than 30 years, well, we are 30 years further. It has not been established. So from that point of view, if you really want to have a solution, we have a solution idea, but like a real solution for practice, I would say then we also need to take into account the political feasibility. The most beautiful solution is a hard law, so introducing a special conflict rule, which would then define highly mobile workers, which is actually a little bit the case now with teleworking we are working on. So we are facing this. But we also know from history that introducing a new conflict rule or amending the regulation, I think the fastest has been 6 years. So still we are facing, is this a solution? Not for tomorrow. If we are really lucky, maybe a bit shorter than 6 years, but for sure not within 1 month. So then I would say Article 16, as addressed by another highly esteemed opponent, is indeed the solution to go on the short term. I hope this answers your question.
But if you go for an option of Article 16, you will have to justify also that option for that group of workers. I mean, what can be the justification ground to go for a kind of bulk approach where you give for that group a special treatment, taking into regard that other workers can be also mobile, maybe not highly mobile, taking into account your definition. What would be the justification ground?
It's indeed true we have to justify a special treatment, otherwise we are coming into discrimination. The justification for this group of workers is that as they see the whole EU as their labor market, this whole instrument has actually as objective to facilitate the free movement of workers, to coordinate social security. But if the result in the end is that these people are actually having more difficult access to social security, I would say the justification is that this instrument is, as it's designed now, not suitable to reach the real objective of this whole instrument. And in addition, we already have special conflict rules for pilots and cabin crew and for seafarers. So these are people who are also very mobile. In that sense, it will not be the first one. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Pauline Mélin. She is Assistant Professor of European Law at our faculty, and she was also a member of the Assessment Committee, and I give her the floor. You have the floor.
Thank you. Dear candidate, congratulations for this wonderful research that you have done. Congratulations to your promoters and to your family, your support system. This journey has been a long one, but the end product is great, I have to say. You were very brave in doing a normative study with so many solutions, as it was highlighted, and the way you wrote was very clear and structured, so I very appreciate that, and I saw that you have still good memories of our pleading skills for your presentation. So overall, congratulations. My question related to few times in your thesis, but also in your presentation, you mentioned the difficulty of legal competence and division of competence between the EU and the member states as being one of the explanations why perhaps the system is not working fully for highly mobile workers. So do you think that there's a need to change the legal competence to find a solution? Would that possibility be used now when we are with the political momentum of treaty change, perhaps? And if not, if it's not necessary to have a change of legal competence, where if you think that it's more a political issue, would it be an idea to go for those member states who are politically willing to go further, for further coordination between those member states on a long-term basis, not exception? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, esteemed opponent. It's indeed true that EU competence for the field of social security is that it is up to the member states to decide what are the rights and what are the obligations. The thing is, with the labor market we have now, we have more flexible labor forms. So temporary agency, we can post them, or we can post them. And this is, I think, might be different than in the beginning of the 50s, 60s, when this instrument has been designed. The issue with that is that this is labor market policies, so it's related to labor law, not social security law. And the instrument, how it's designed now, it's only focusing on social security, but dealing with people who are engaged in kind of flexible work forms. So we have a kind of correlation between labor law and social security. If we want to change that, like if you want to have more social security protection, it's not defined on EU law, and it cannot be defined on EU law because of the competence division. That would indeed need a treaty change, which, as you said yourself, I don't think is very feasible at the moment. We have Poland, we have Hungary, and we have also an interesting change in Italy at the moment. So I don't think that's feasible to change the treaty in the coming years. So how could we then tackle this? Maybe we could think about what is then social security floors. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the inauguration lecture of Professor Schoukens has called what is the social model. I would say draw a line of no, at least at what is the least what we would like to have in the EU, and start from that. If we take that as a basis, there are a few member states who could continue by enhanced cooperation indeed. That's based in a treaty, but also based on the regulation itself. Article 8.2 also allows bilateral and multilateral treaties to conclude in the spirit of the regulations. So in that sense, I think this has more chance for the future for this group of people. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Then the opposition will be continued by Dr. Saskia Montebovi. She is Assistant Professor of Social Law at our faculty and also a member of the Assessment Committee. I give her the floor. You have the floor.
Thank you. Dear candidate, congratulations with this masterpiece. There are many, many topics that I would like to discuss with you, but luckily there are other members of the committee here already pinpointed several of the prominent themes the highly mobile worker has to deal with. And the main value of your book is that you analyze and demonstrate eloquently how these highly mobile workers often fall between two stools, which leads, of course, to a legal uncertainty about their social security protection. And my question relates to that enormous challenge of uncertainty and often also the inadequate social protection due to their geographic mobility and job mobility. Therefore, I would like now to turn to your ideas for a solution to address this legal uncertainty and the shortcomings of the current coordination rules. So the question is, what are your thoughts on a separate status for the highly mobile workers? Is that possible and desirable?
Thank you for your question. That's a tricky one, if it's desirable. Well, I hope my book, after reading my book, you're convinced that I think it is desirable for this group of people. Whether that is possible, I think it's possible if there is political willingness to do so. And that takes a little time. I assume you would also like to know how that is possible. I will do an attempt. Well, first of all, I think if there is a good argumentation for an Article 16 agreement on bilateral, multilateral basis, I think that is definitely possible. For that, we need to define very well who is highly mobile workers, so who can make use of this, and who is not. So a clear definition of who is a highly mobile worker is, in that case, necessary. And instead, I would argue not to go to, a person needs to be an employee, or the person needs to be a civil servant to go. So go to the classification of work, as I think in every member state, the kind of jobs are classified differently, so that will increase the complexity again. So you have a new problem you're creating. In that case, I would say connect it to how much work, whatever the status is, are you performing, and then seeing if these people could be qualified as highly mobile workers. So Article 16 is, I think, possible, but a more beautiful would be a special conflict rule for this group.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Herwig Verschuren. He is Professor of International and European Social Law at the University of Antwerp, and I welcome him most warmly. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, first of all, dear candidate, I also have to congratulate you with this excellent work, as the other opponents already have done. The dissertation is indeed starting with a well-precised scope, a very well-defined research question, a very well-explained methodology. The bottom-up approach you use is really an added value for this work. You critically examine the law as it stands, and you indeed very convincingly demonstrate that the current legal framework is not fit for the highly mobile workers, and indeed leads to legal uncertainty. And step by step you identify problems, and you come up with different proposals to more legal certainty. So very well done. Congratulations also to the supervisors and to the members of the assessment committee. Now, your research is conducted by listing the pros and the cons of every idea you developed, and the result of which is that at the end of each analysis, one may wonder whether the solutions you suggest will not raise new questions and uncertainties on how to interpret and implement them, as also was clear in some of the answers. And referring to the subtitle of your dissertation, closing one Pandora's box risks opening another, of course. But I would also like to take the opportunity to welcome you in the very exclusive club of academics specialized in EU social security law. And I'm indeed very glad that the new generation is ready to take over. But first a question. On page 35, you state that the balancing exercise of fundamental freedom rights in relation to EU coordination instrument is not reflected upon in your study. But still, the Court of Justice always said that EU secondary law, including the social security regulations, of course, must be interpreted in the light of the treaties. And in that context, the Court repeatedly stressed that the state of employment principle, the lex loci laboris, reflects the equal treatment provision to migrant workers in Article 45 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. So my question is, are you sure that your proposals are really treaty-proof? Which of course is a condition to guarantee legal certainty. And if this is debatable, are you then advocating, or would you advocate, reinterpreting the treaty, or even modifying the treaty, not with regard to competences, but with regard to the principle of the lex loci laboris as reflecting the equal treatment provision of Article 45? What is your view on this?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for your highly interesting question. I understand your question as that how is the principle of equal treatment for workers guaranteed with all kind of solutions I propose. Because indeed, if we make a special conflict rules for highly mobile workers, why do we treat them differently, so not equal than all the others? The EU regulation has as main rule the lex loci laboris, so it's striving for equal treatment in the country where you work, in the employment state. Indeed, if you make a special rule for highly mobile workers that determines the state of residence, this is then not leading to equal treatment in the state of employment. That is true. However, the regulation itself, and thus the EU legislator, allows not equal treatment in the state of employment itself by the posting provision in Article 12 and the multi-activity rule by Article 13. So in certain situations, it decides it's okay to be not having equal treatment in the state of employment, but have equal treatment in the state of residence. From that point of view, I would say it's already the EU legislator itself that allows unequal treatment with the state of employment in certain situations. And as I argue in my book, is that posting Article 12 has a limit on the not equal treatment in the state of employment, namely that of 24 months. Article 13, however, has no limit. Once you are considered as doing multiple activities and working in 2 or more countries, you can do this for your whole working life. There is no limit in the unequal treatment that Article 13 provides. And even more, we can see that there is an enormous shift from using posting under Article 12 to posting under Article 13. We had also the court case of Forma 2, that actually employers are trying to post under Article 13. That's very advantage for them because there is no limit. They can do it forever. They can post their employees during the whole EU territory for unlimited time. I think the court made a limit in Forma 2 as it made the link between 12 and 13. So as to answer your question, is this my solutions for unequal treatment? Are they treaty proof? I think as long as we can link it to, yes, this facilitates the free movement of workers, and in this case, highly mobile workers, I think this is treaty proof. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. But where do you draw the line between what is then acceptable and what is not acceptable? And it comes back to the question of the other opponent. From which point of view is a person highly mobile and not just a mobile worker who can rely on Article 45 of the treaty? But it comes back to the same question.
Yes. You would like me to elaborate it?
Well, maybe you may reflect on that last point. Yeah? No? That ends the first round of questions, but of course there are more questions. And it's my pleasure to start the second round by giving the floor to my colleague Professor Paul Schoukens for his contribution and his question. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I indeed have had a series of questions, 3, something like that. And in the deliberation before this session, I suggested first to ask my most easy question, and then to come in a second round, the slightly more naughty question, because I thought that we would not come to a second round. But unfortunately, we are there. And the question is on one of the suggestions you make. I mean, I think one of the elements here in your thesis, dear candidate, is, and that's what was one of the elements I also assessed as very positive, is that you come with some very interesting ideas and some very interesting suggestions. And one of them, I think, was on page 184. I have to make sure because I used another copy of your thesis when reading and making my assessment some months ago. 184, where you made the suggestion to disconnect the financing from the benefits. And you gave it a very nice exotic name of the Nordic system or Nordic model, where you made a reference to the Nordic system. That's not the first time. I remember in 1996, and I think colleague Verschuur was also, and colleague Joris were there also present, in the Stockholm archipel, we were celebrating 25 years of the Coordination Regulation 1408/71, not of the Coordination Regulation because it was already older, but 1408/71. And at that moment, I think two suggestions were made to use more elements of the Nordic or the universal social protection scheme, one by colleague Peters and one from the colleague from Helsinki. They were different. Peters was making the distinction between cost compensation and income replacement benefits. And the Finnish colleague was asking to use more elements of residential social security into the coordination, because the Nordic states were very frustrated that due to the lex loci laboris, they were forced to introduce into their national systems more Bismarckian way of thinking and Bismarckian elements of social security. And when I first saw your suggestion, I was thinking, well, maybe this can be the opposite, and then the professional systems, the Bismarckian systems, will be frustrated that they have to introduce more universal, more Beveridgean approaches into there, and you have the kind of mirror view of what we have now, and the problems, but then in the opposite side. But it's a bit more subtle, your suggestion, and you unveil it to some extent, but not completely. And I was wondering, what do you exactly mean? Because on the one hand, you suggest that, well, we have to introduce some common ways of calculating and designing benefits using point systems, you say. That means that national systems will have to adapt themselves. I mean, some countries, like in France, they are used to work with point systems, but many others, they are not used. So we will impose upon them that kind of calculation of how to design a benefit, taking into account the points, and the points are in relation to the financing which has been paid in. So if we follow that pathway, that means quite a change into the system and quite some elements of harmonization. Yes, I dare to say it, harmonization of a common approach, which is imposed by the European Union on the national social security systems, meaning that suddenly the Netherlands will also have to keep track of the record income and have to guarantee a certain benefit, taking into account maybe they have some options here within the country not to provide benefits in certain cases, but suddenly they will be confronted with that element of imposing by the EU. Or you do it the other way around, you say, no, we are not going to do too much. It will be the residence system in the end of the day paying out the benefits. And I think every country which have been collecting contributions in a pro rata way then will finance the residence system in the end. But I think that kind of very limited approach will not work, I think, because then from the financing side, you will have to come again with a coordination. If you're working in 2, 3, 4 countries, it is impossible unless you say, well, everybody can finance, but I don't think it's so easy because the national rules can be different. I think the first one was your belief, your kind of approach where you say we have to have a kind of common approach to some extent, but I'm not 100% sure, and I would like to hear from you, how far should we go then with the harmonization of the common structure, because you made a reference to the 13th state there as well. It was a mixture of coordination and harmonization. You said, well, it was a nice idea, but it's still laying there. I mean, it has been developed. So how far should that kind of approach go? Because I think it has potential, the idea, and I think it was a very innovative way of looking at this problem.
Thank you for your second question, highly esteemed opponent. I would like to start, how did I come to this idea? Well, it's indeed already implemented in the Nordic systems. Thinking about highly mobile workers, we are facing that the state of employment is changing. If we look to the conflict rules, they look to the work pattern. Okay, well then we can look, okay, let's then for this group of workers make the connecting factor the state of residence. That would definitely be the more stable connection. I do exclude these people, the digital nomads, as you may have heard of in my research. But if we go to the state of residence, there is another assumption below it, namely that we are living in the same country all the time, which is not always the case for highly mobile workers, because if you are maybe doing a job in Italy and then the next year in Norway, I'm not sure whether you will stay remaining living in Italy. Well, maybe nowadays with remote and teleworking, yes, but apart from that, then I have been thinking about, okay, so what is then the stable connecting factor? I see the conflict rules as actually a solution, as a tool to appoint the most stable connecting factor to a social society and a social security system. Well, with highly mobile workers, it's not their employment. The state of residence where they live, maybe, but not in all cases. So then we have again a problem. So my idea was, what is the most stable element is themselves. Actually, the worker working themselves. That's the only stable element. Coming up with that idea, then I found the Nordic Scandinavian ideas, who actually make social security dependent on the person, the working person, and not so much the classification of work or where the work is performed. So that's how I introduced this idea. As you also noticed, I didn't introduce it in my recommendation, in my concluding chapter, because yes, I agree. There are some questions to this idea, and it can maybe lead to harmonization of laws. Is that okay? Is that preventable? I think still a highly mobile worker conflict rule is the best way to go. But if we cannot define them well, or we cannot justify the unequal treatment for this kind of group of workers, we could maybe think about a system for this kind of very mobile, in both living and working people, that is working with points. I would not say it should be a change for all conflict rules and all kind of workers, but for this kind of very mobile workers, it could be a separate solution instead of a conflict rule.
Then I only have one small. Would it be possible to define residence? Because then you know that the emphasis will be put upon residence. We all assume residence is clear-cut, but it's not always the case.
No, that's exactly why I didn't treat it in my research, also because I have a very nice colleague who just did a research about more residence. What is residence based on EU law is also differently determined than based on national law. So yes, residence would open up another Pandora's box.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Marion Werenpaas. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Dear candidate, my second question is about posting. On page 79, you state, during the period, referring to the posting term, the employers have to pay the comparatively low social security contributions in the state from which the workers are posted. I wonder where the statement that social security contributions are comparatively low in the sending state originates from. Does that not depend from which member states you are posted? For example, in 2020, posting numbers from Belgium were rather significant, and Belgium is not reputed for low social security contributions. And in addition, was Article 12 of the Regulation 883/2004 not written to relieve the administrative burden and precisely to prevent the yo-yo effect you described of switching social security systems every time? In other words, can Article 12, for example, be adapted if once a highly mobile worker is defined in such a way that that would be a solution for these kinds of workers?
Thank you for your question, highly esteemed opponent. In order to be able to be posted, it must be, it's related to the free movement of services as well. So it's a service to another business organization in another member state. I think posting could be a solution partly for highly mobile workers. For me, it's not clear yet if a person is engaged in several work engagements. One of them could be civil servant, one is an employee, whether this person can then within one part also be posted. So you would have an Article 13 situation, a person who is engaged in 2 or more member states with 2 jobs, could then also be Article 12 be applied. So you would use 13 and 12 at the same time. For me, that's not yet clear out of the jurisprudence of the...
Eva van Ooij, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes. In the meantime, let's take a closer look at Maastricht University's renowned teaching method, problem-based learning. Once the pro-rector reconvenes the session, we'll tune in and continue the live stream.
Problem-based learning, or PBL. What does that mean exactly? 3 of my fellow students and I will show you around. Every week, we analyze a different case or issue together. We discuss the case and everyone can contribute different perspectives to the group discussion. If we get stuck, our tutor helps us out and suggests what we could do next. I prefer going to the library to prepare. Here, I can focus and I have quick access to books or journals that help me understand the case. Today, I can also train my stitching skills in the Skills Lab, where you can immediately put into practice what you've learned. After a day like this, I like going to the gym to clear my head and get ready for the next day.
At UM, you meet people from all around the world. Hello guys. Some of them are doing their exchange semester here, and they often say that PBL helps them learn and retain things very easily. I can understand why. It's a very active way of learning because you have to bring your own perspective to real-life cases. You have a lot of freedom to manage your time, your studies, your hobbies, and your work. Of course, that also means a lot of responsibility. Right now, for example, I'm arranging my exchange semester in Madrid. How cool is that? In this group session, we're the managers who have to allocate the resources of a real company. This is how we put into practice what we learned this morning. Studying here means being proactive and learning to plan well. Prioritizing and performing well under stress are great skills that help you develop as a person. But now, it's time to grab a coffee at the Student Service Center.
Right now, we're at the Brightlands Camelot campus. Here we can apply knowledge from lectures and tutorials in a practical setting. This helps us understand what we have learned and further develop our lab skills. Today, we're determining the amounts of cholesterol in various products. What I really like is the project periods at the end of each semester, where we complete a full research project. That includes planning, collecting data, analyzing, and presenting the findings. That way we learn how research works and we're able to see what it's like to be a real scientist. After practicals, I have to write a lab report that also helps me process everything I have learned today. UM has a lot of learning spaces where you can work on your own or with other students. This evening, I'm meeting my friends for a movie night organized by the MSP Study Association.
If you study law, you have to read quite a lot. Not all information is relevant, so you learn how to easily find the information you need to solve your case. In the afternoon, I have to give a presentation, so I like to practice it with a fellow student. Later today, a lawyer is giving a lecture. This will help us better understand the case we're working on. Speaking in front of a group is quite exciting the first time round, but you get to used to it quickly. And having to present helps you also to adopt knowledge better. What I like the most is that we sometimes get to enter a plea in front of a real judge. These moot courts are really exciting. Now it's time for drinks with friends. Studying is important, but so is relaxing once in a while.
Hij mag naar de hoofdhunshow. De hoofdhunshow? Ja, de hoofdpromotor. Ja, gewoon rechts. Oké, dan is het goed. Oké.
Eva van Ooij. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Saskia Kloster, one of your supervisors, is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor now to take the floor.
Wil u gaan staan?
Belooft u dat u altijd volgens de beginselen van de wetenschappelijke integriteit te werk zult gaan? Eerlijk, zorgvuldig, transparant, onafhankelijk en verantwoordelijk.
Ja, dat beloof ik.
Krachtens de bevoegdheid ons door de wet toegekend, volgens het besluit van de commissie hier vertegenwoordigd, verklaar ik u hierbij Eva Catharina van Ooij tot dokter te bevorderen en alle rechten te verlenen die daaraan volgens de wet en gewoonte zijn verbonden. Ten bewijze hiervan overhandig ik u zometeen de bul door de rector, secretaris en overige leden van de promotiecommissie ondertekend en met het grootzegel van de universiteit bevestigd.
Ik mag. Geachte dokter Eva Catharina van Ooij. Beste Eva. Je mag je dokter noemen. Je bent er. You did it, basically. Hè? Saskia en ik zijn gewoon echt hartstikke blij voor je. En ik kan niet anders zeggen dat het dokterschap heel erg verdiend is. Heel formeel is dat zo, omdat het onderzoek dat je hebt gedaan en de manier waarop je dat hier vandaag hebt verdedigd aan de gestelde eisen voldoet. Je hebt bewezen, of jezelf bewezen als een zelfstandige onderzoeker, die zaken zowel op papier als mondeling goed uiteen kan zetten. Er zijn echter meerdere redenen waarom die dokterstitel echt meer dan verdiend is. Je bent nogal een veelzijdig mens. Je hebt niet het traditionele pad gevolgd om hier vandaag te kunnen staan. Na je middelbare school, hier in Maastricht, als ik het goed heb, was het eerst de muziek, de cello die je trok en die je uiteindelijk op heel wat plaatsen grensoverschrijdend in Europa heeft gebracht. Opleidingen in Amsterdam, Utrecht, Brussel, Freiburg en Basel, als ik het goed heb, hebben je uiteindelijk bachelor- en mastertitels in de muziek opgeleverd. Pas daarna ben je echt gaan richten op het recht. En dat ging je opvallend goed af. Binnen no time had je een master en een bachelor in European Law. En een hoogtepunt, ik neem aan ook voor jouzelf, was het winnen van de EU Law Moot Court Competition in 2014. Die uiteindelijk ook een hele prestigieuze stage bij het Hof van Justitie heeft opgeleverd. Die link met muziek is nooit verdwenen. Afgezien van het feit dat je nog steeds speelt, optreedt, heeft die muziek je ook geleid naar het onderwerp van je masterscriptie. En nu ook dus het proefschrift. Veel muzici, zoals die van het André Rieu Orchestra, zijn highly mobile. Ze passeren de grenzen zeer frequent. En of ze dat nu altijd zelf in de gaten hebben of niet, ze worden geconfronteerd met tal van juridische obstakels. Vooral ook op het terrein van het sociale zekerheidsrecht. Die obstakels die vormen het onderwerp van je onderzoek. Die heb je in kaart gebracht en bovenal ben je op zoek gegaan naar oplossingen. Als ik het boek nu weer even opensla en overzie, dan valt het me echt op, en dat vind ik opvallend eigenlijk, dat 200 van die 300 pagina's zijn gericht op oplossingen. Het is kijkend naar de toekomst. En die keuze om je te richten op oplossingen was eigenlijk best wel gedurfd. En heel veel auteurs hebben zich niet over die oplossingen uitgelaten. Heel veel literatuur is er niet. En dat betekent dat je heel veel zelfstandig, creatief denkwerk moest verrichten om tot al die opties te komen en ze uit te werken. Heel veel andere PhD-kandidaten hadden er wellicht voor gekozen, heel simpel, de state of the art te beschrijven, wat obstakels te schetsen en dan te concluderen met wat recommendations. Dat heb jij dus niet gedaan. En je was helemaal niet bang om die uitdaging, want het was een uitdaging om oplossingen te vinden, aan te gaan. En dat heb je gewoon, en ik denk dat ik namens de hele corona mag spreken, op een hele knappe wijze gedaan. De oplossing, de ideale oplossing, die is er wellicht niet. Maar die 200 pagina's aan denkwerk, die je hebt gewijd aan hoe moet het nu verder, ja, die geven heel veel food for thought en vormen ook een perfecte basis voor verder onderzoek. Dat je misschien zelf niet altijd gaat doen, maar voor anderen in elk geval. Voor Saskia en mij was het echt een plezier om je in dat proces van opleiding, oplossingen vinden, te begeleiden. We hebben tal van discussies gehad. Die waren heel vaak stimulerend, ook al gingen ze vaak over heel andere dingen dan die highly mobile workers. Je bent niet bang om vrij te denken, je mening te uiten en het met anderen, ons ook, oneens te zijn. De discussies waren gewoon prikkelend en wij hebben ook van jou veel geleerd. Ja, zoals je het in het voorwoord zegt, wij hebben je gedwongen om to the point te zijn en weg te laten wat je kunt weglaten. Als ik vandaag naar je heb geluisterd, heb je die boodschap heel goed begrepen. Maar wij hebben er ook veel van geleerd. Van al die discussies, en wat ik zelf ook heb geleerd, is dat ik misschien te veel to the point ben. Dus waren we aan het praten en ik zei even to the point. En zei ja, maar. En dan komen er weer nieuwe discussies, nieuwe ideeën naar voren. Of zoals onze Belgische collega's dat zouden noemen, er komen nieuwe denkpistes bovendrijven. Voor Saskia en mij was het gewoon super inspirerend om met je samen te werken en het was heel prettig. En het feit dat we hier vandaag 3 Belgische kopstukken op het terrein van het Europees Sociaal Recht aanwezig hebben, mag jij als een heel groot compliment voor jezelf beschouwen. In je voorwoord beschrijf je het hele proces van je PhD-onderzoek als gosh, wat een journey. Wat een marathon. Ik neem aan dat gosh verwijst naar een aantal obstakels die je bent tegengekomen. En ja, die zijn er geweest, laten we eerlijk zijn. Maar ik moet zeggen dat wij zeggen, dat je dat op heel bewonderenswaardige wijze over die obstakels bent heen gekomen. Soms gestruikeld, maar je bent nooit gevallen. En je hebt in dit hele proces niet alleen heel veel academische intelligentie, creativiteit, maar ook heel veel vechtersmentaliteit getoond. En dat is meer dan bewonderenswaardig. Heel knap. Die hele journey, gosh journey, die marathon, die heb je niet alleen hoeven af te leggen. Er zijn heel veel mensen die je hebben gesteund. En ik bedank je in je voorwoord ook. Eentje daarvan die wil ik even highlighten als het mag. En dat is Hildegard. Ze wou hier vandaag zijn, maar ze is ziek. Dus als het goed is, als het kan, luistert ze mee. Maar ze wou er echt graag zijn. Ze was niet alleen de begeleider van je scriptie, die ten grondslag lag ook aan je proefschrift, dat je hier hebt verdedigd. Ze was zeker in het begin ook, bood ze je unieke gastvrijheid. En zij heeft er eigenlijk voor gezorgd dat het onderzoek überhaupt kon plaatsvinden. Zonder Hildegard hadden we hier wellicht niet gestaan met z'n allen vandaag. Dus Hildegard, als je luistert, dank je wel. En ik neem aan dat ik ook zeg namens Eva. Er rest mij te zeggen dat ook je familie en andere geliefden heel erg trots op je mogen zijn, net zoals wij dat zijn. De mensen van de SVB aanwezig mogen hun handjes dichtknijpen dat Eva bij jullie werkt en helaas niet bij ons. Eva, dank je wel. Veel succes met wat je ook verder gaat doen. En nogmaals van harte gefeliciteerd.
Dear Dr. Eva van Ooij, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. And I add on a personal note my wish for you for every success in your life and future career. And then I have a piece of information for the audience, for your guests in the audience. Of course, we are all eager to congratulate the young doctor. May I request you to go directly from here to the location where the reception will take place and which is indicated in the invitation for today. Here in this building, only the corona, the professors present here, will have the opportunity to congratulate you with your degree. And having said that, I close this academic ceremony.